The Haunted Spacesuit, written by Arthur C. Clarke. The spacesuits we use on the station are completely different from the flexible affairs men wear when they want to walk around on the moon. Ours are really baby spaceships, just big enough to hold one man. They are stubby cylinders, about 7 feet long, fitted with low-powered propulsion jets, and have a pair of accordion-like sleeves at the upper end for the operator's arms. As soon as I'd settled down inside my very exclusive spacecraft, I switched on power and checked the gauges on the tiny instrument panel. All my needles were well in the safety zone, so I lowered the transparent hemisphere over my head and sealed myself in. For a short trip like this, I did not bother to check the suit's internal lockers, which were used to carry food and special equipment for extended missions. It was at that moment, as I launched myself out into the abyss, that I knew that something was horribly wrong. It is never completely silent inside a spacesuit. You can always hear the gentle hiss of oxygen, the faint whir of fans and motors, the susurration of your own breathing, even, if you listen carefully enough, the rhythmic thump that is the pounding of your heart. These sounds reverberate through the suit, unable to escape into the surrounding void. They are the unnoticed background of life in space, for you are aware of them only when they change. They had changed now. To them had been added a sound, which I could not identify. It was an intermittent, muffled thudding, sometimes accompanied by a scraping noise, as of metal upon metal. I froze instantly, holding my breath and trying to locate the alien sound with my ears. The meters on the control board gave no clues. All the needles were rock steady on their scales, and there were none of the flickering red lights that would warn of impending disaster. That was some comfort, but not much. I had long ago learned to trust my instincts in such matters. It was their alarm signals that were flashing now, telling me to return to the station before it was too late. It was no longer possible to pretend that the noise disturbing me was that of some faulty mechanism. Though I was in utter isolation, far from any other human being or indeed any material object, I was not alone. The soundless void was bringing to my ears the faint but unmistakable stirrings of life. In that first, heart-freezing moment, it seemed that something was trying to get into my suit, something invisible, seeking shelter from the cruel and pitiless vacuum of space. I whirled madly in my harness, scanning the entire sphere of vision around me. There was nothing there, of course. There could not be. Yet that purposeful scrabbling was clearer than ever. Despite the nonsense that has been written about us, it is not true that spacemen are superstitious. But can you blame me if, as I came to the end of logic's resources, I suddenly remembered how Bernie Summers had died, no further from the station than I was at this very moment? It was one of those impossible accidents. It always is. 3 things had gone wrong at once. Bernie's oxygen regulator had run wild and sent the pressure soaring. The safety valve had failed to blow, and a faulty joint had given way. In a fraction of a second, his suit was open to space. I had never known Bernie, but suddenly his fate became of overwhelming importance to me, for a horrible idea had come into my mind. One does not talk about these things, but a damaged spacesuit is too valuable to be thrown away, even if it has killed its wearer. It is repaired, renumbered, and issued to someone else. What happens to the soul of a man who dies between the stars, far from his native world? Are you still here, Bernie, clinging to the last object that linked you to your lost and distant home? As I fought the nightmares that were swirling around me, for now it seemed that the scratchings and soft fumblings were coming from all directions, there was one last hope to which I clung. For the sake of sanity, I had to prove that this wasn't Bernie's suit, that the metal walls so closely wrapped around me had never been another man's coffin. It took me several tries before I could press the right button and switch my transmitter to the emergency wavelength. "Station," I gasped. "I'm in trouble. Get records to check my suit history and—" I never finished. They say my yell wrecked the microphone. But what man, alone in the absolute isolation of space, would not have yelled when something patted him softly on the back of the neck? Return to Earth, written by Unknown. I guess it started almost a month ago, although it could be longer. There are only the clocks scattered around the house to tell me how long, and half of those are dead now. Anyway, I'm straying from the point. It was on the news. A cruise ship sank for no reason. It wasn't damaged, just pulled straight down. Then the rest of the stories flooded in. Everything in the water was sinking. Oil rigs disappeared. People on the beach are pulled down into the abyss. Nobody seemed able to explain why this was happening. Nothing floated anymore. It was bizarre. This filled the news for a couple of days until it just got frightening. It was during one broadcast that it changed for the worse. It was a report from some beach, an on-location report about this strange phenomenon. They were just recycling the same questions we had all been asking for days. Suddenly, panic seemed to grip the face of the reporter. She screamed as the camera quickly tilted down. Her feet were sunk into the sand down to her shin. I remember smirking, thinking it was just some overly sensitive reporter messing up, but then the camera dropped. The remaining 10 or so seconds that followed showed not just the reporter sinking into the sand, but all of them. The whole media circus had descended on the beach to cover the same story. The reporter, who was down to her shin a minute ago, was now down to her chest. The shot of writhing, screaming, and sinking people ended shortly as the camera was engulfed by the sand. The news stayed on a few more days, but there was nothing to say. Some blamed sinkholes for what happened on the beach, while others argued against them from the safety of their downtown studio. The news was a waste of time now. It was much easier to look out the window. It was more or less a ghost town outside. Everyone was inside, afraid to leave their homes. It didn't seem to make sense. The roads and pavements were being absorbed by grass and dirt. Street signs and traffic lights were being consumed by the plants. Houses, too. Some people tried to run, jumping from rooftop to rooftop, looking for higher ground. Occasionally, while flicking through what was left of the TV broadcasts, skyscrapers had become refugee camps. I had made one trip out of the house since this started, across the rooftops, an attempt to get supplies from a nearby supermarket, but that planned seemed to be a waste of time. It was a husk by the time I got there, looted and pillaged. There was all the evidence I needed to see how bad this whole thing was. It's easy to be in denial about something like whatever this was until it really seems to affect you. When I got back to my house, I noticed something. My car was gone. Well, almost. You could still see the top poking out from the overgrowth and loose soil. And not just my car, all of them. Bigger vehicles were still in sight, only partially obscured, but they were going down too. A few days later, my whole bottom floor was subterranean. I'd managed to block the windows and door from bursting in from all the dirt and soil, but it was just a cell now, a mausoleum, not somewhere I wanted to be. I spent most of my time by an upstairs window, staring at the hostile world outside. My neighbor died yesterday. He fell off his roof and was swallowed by the earth. He's not the first person to do that either. What made it notable was why he fell. He was trying to stop his dog from getting out. The dog's fine. Well, I assume so. It ran off. They're not affected. The animals. This is our fate. That nihilistic little discovery was too much for me to bear. This whole thing, a living fucking nightmare. I hit the bottle hard and passed out for the night. When I woke up, my head pounded in the darkness. I flicked the light switches and the fuses, but the power was out. I took the flashlight by the fuse box and looked around the house for any supplies. While checking the upstairs, I saw it. The last glimpse of natural light I'll ever see. I had been thinking it was just night, that I had slept all day in an alcohol coma. By the time I could cross the room to the window, it was gone. I was underground. I tried to get out, smashing through plaster and tiles to be greeted with a stream of soil pouring out from where the sky should be. I don't know how much longer I've got in here, in my house-sized coffin. There's only so much food and so much air. I've got a little bit of light, a couple of candles, and a book of matches. The flashlight died some time ago. But this is our fate. Man's fate. Our return to the earth. The Mist, written by Peter Carter. The big man grunted, then spoke slowly. Can't do that, mister. I go into town Saturday nights. This is Saturday night. The little man on the porch was trembling as he leaned forward, trying to catch the words above the noise of the hounds baying in the side yard. His small, alert face was pale, drawn, his eyes too eager. He gave the appearance of being smaller somehow than he should be, as though he were shrunken. His clothes hung on him, too large. His eyes were tired, lost-looking. Mr. Brown, please listen. If this is real, this time not a rumor, please. Brown shook his head slowly, his eyes careful. But it's what I've searched for, Mr. Brown. You've seen it. Others have. You've sworn to the truth of it. Sure. Brown spat, nodded his head. Sure. And them as says, we ain't our liars, for sure. I know, Mr. Brown. I'm an investigator of psychic phenomena, of ghosts and things. I must see that apparition tonight. The shrunken man closed his eyes for an instant, leaned against the porch post. Saturday night. But, Mr. Brown, this will be the last night. Might be here right along now. I don't know. I know, Mr. Brown. The little man rubbed at his finger with the big golden ring on it. I know, another 10 minutes at the most, and I've got to... He stopped, let his eyes beg for him. Well, I reckon it's worth looking at, right enough. You're sure of what it looks like? I know what I seen. Golden and glowing it is. You gotta have dark to see it. Real dark. It don't move exactly. Just stays still but sorta shimmies like. That's it, Mr. Brown. I've gotta see it. Reckon that's out, mister. I'm going to town. Brown watched the little man's eyes, saw the pain in them. Course, if it's worth something. Reckon it'd have to be for me to stay home Saturday night. It would take a minute, a moment. I gotta be getting along. It's worth everything to me, Mr. Brown. Everything. How much? I don't have money. I begged rides for 700 miles to get here. Brown shook his head. Nice ring you got. Well, I gotta be getting to town. The little man dropped his hand to his side. Then he raised it again. His eyes, too, moved to the curiously shaped ring on his finger. I can't let you have that. Brown shrugged his big shoulders, stepped back, and fingered the inside doorknob. I gotta lock up now and let out the hounds. Don't be hanging around the yard when I let out the hounds. No. Wait. You can have the ring. Brown closed his eyes. I don't know. You can have it. The big man opened the screen door, took the ring. He stepped back so the little man could come through the doorway. Brown struck a match, lit the lamp on the table. He turned the ring over and over, very slowly, in his thick fingers. His eyes squinted shrewdly, golden but not gold, too heavy for gold, or any other metal, much too large for the little man's fingers. Brown pushed it on his last finger, felt it grip the flesh. The little man, moving nervously, found the bedroom door. Brown gave him a rough shove. Go ahead. You paid, and it ain't nothing to hurt a man." But the little man stood aside, let Brown lead the way. It was a golden blot in the air, shimmering in the center of the bedroom, 8 feet high perhaps, and about 4 wide. Brown laughed coarsely. "Not a spook, is it, mister?" I knew it wasn't. "Reckon you was paying for a spook?" "Course I didn't say it was a spook." The little man's face hardened. He looked at Brown appraisingly, sadly. Then he shrugged. "I can't quite believe you really walked through that, Brown." "Sure." The big man laughed. "Sure I did. Watch. Wait, I'll walk with you. Wait." The little man stepped forward, then, as though still uncertain, put his fingers on Brown's arm. "All right." Together, they moved forward into the golden mist. It was different for the big man, this time. As they entered the mist, he felt sharp tingles dance over his skin. Before, there had been nothing but the feel of air. He started to step back, was stopped by surprising strength from the little man. Brown was forced forward. The tingling was almost unbearable. It seemed to come in hot flashes now, from the finger that wore the ring. Brown hurried, trying to get back to the familiar bedroom. They stepped out of the mist. There was no familiar bedroom. The house was gone, and with it the night. Daylight. Daytime on a countryside where the grass was blue as Brown had never seen it, and where trees were slender, unbranched needles reaching for an orange sky. A sky in which Brown could see 3 gigantic suns. The big man ripped free, swore, spun back to face the mist. The little man shook his head. "We just made it, Brown. The mist is gone." The little man was changing. He seemed to grow, fill out his clothes. "I'm sorry, Brown. I couldn't get through except with the ring, or with someone wearing the ring. That meant it had to be you. This is crazy. Where?" The big man stopped, looked again at the suns. He rubbed his forehead. "Home, my home. Find another mist while you wear the ring. Then go home, to your home." "But a mist?" "You'll hear rumors, wild tales. We have stories of ghosts here too. Be an investigator. Track down those rumors. But good luck, Brown." The little man turned quickly, began walking across the strange blue grass. Once he looked back, saw Brown staring helplessly after him. He hesitated for an instant, then hurried on. In a moment, he was among the needle trees, then out of Brown's sight. The Ambassadors, written by Anthony Boucher. Nothing so much amazed the first Martian expedition. No, not even the answer, which should have been so obvious from the first, to the riddle of the canals, as the biological nature of the Martians themselves. Popular fiction and scientific thought alike had conditioned the members of the expedition to expect either of 2 possibilities: a race more or less like ourselves, if possibly high-domed and bulge-chested, or a swarm of tentacled and pulpy horrors. With either the familiar or the monstrously unfamiliar, we were prepared to make contact. We had given no thought to the likeness with a difference which we encountered. It was on the night of the expedition's official welcome to Mars, after that exchange of geometrical and astronomical diagrams, which had established for each race the intelligence of the other, that the zoologist Professor Hunyadi classified his observations. That the Martians were mammals was self-evident. Certain points concerning their teeth, their toes, and the characteristic tufts of hair on their cheekbones led Professor Hunyadi to place them, somewhat to the bewilderment of his non-zoological colleagues, as Fissipede arctoids. Further technicalities involving such matters as the shape of the nozzle and the number and distribution of the nipples led him from the family Canidae through the genus Canis to the species Lupus. My ultimate classification, gentlemen, he asserted, must be Canis lupus sapiens. In other words, as man may be said to be an intelligent ape, we are here confronted with a race of intelligent wolves. Some Martian zoologist was undoubtedly reaching and expounding analogous conclusions at that same moment, and the results were evident when the first interplanetary conference resumed its wordless and symbolic deliberations on the following day. For if it was difficult for our representatives to take seriously the actions of what seemed a pack of amazingly clever and well-trained dogs, it was all but impossible for the Martians to find anything save amusement in the antics of a troop of space-touring monkeys. An Earthman, in those days, would use "you cur" as an indication of contempt. To a Martian, anyone addressed as "you primate" was not only contemptible, but utterly ridiculous. By the time the first conference was over, and the more brilliant linguists of each group had managed to master something of the verbal language of the other, traces of a reluctant mutual respect had begun to dawn. This was particularly true of the Earthmen, who had at heart a genuine, if somewhat patronizing fondness for dogs, and even wolves, whereas the Martians had never possessed any warmth of feeling for monkeys, and certainly not for great apes. Possibly because he had first put his finger on the cause, it was Professor Hunyadi who was especially preoccupied on the return voyage, with the nagging thought that some fresh device must be found if the two races were to establish their interplanetary intercourse on a solid footing. It is fortunate indeed that the professor had, as he tells us in his memoirs, spent so many happy hours at the feet of his Transylvanian grandmother. For thus he alone, of that crew of superb specialists, was capable of conceiving the solution that was to revolutionize the history of two planets. The world press alternated between roars of laughter and screams of rage when the returned zoologist issued his eloquent plea on a worldwide video hookup for volunteer werewolves as ambassadors to the wolves of Mars. Barbarous though it may seem to us now, mankind was at that time divided into three groups: those who disbelieved in werewolves, those who hated and feared werewolves, and, of course, those who were werewolves. The fortunate position of three hitherto unsuspected individuals of this last category served to still both the laughter and the rage of the press. Professor Garu of Duke University received from Hunyadi's impassioned plea the courage at last to publish his monumental thesis, based on the earlier research of Williamson, proving once and for all that the lycanthropic metamorphosis involves nothing supernatural, but a strictly scientific exercise of psychokinetic powers in the rearrangement of molecular structure, an exercise at which Garu admitted he was himself adept. This revelation in turn emboldened Cardinal Mezzolupo, a direct descendant of the much misinterpreted Wolf of Gubbio, to confess the sting of the flesh which had long buffeted him, and taking his text from the Q, Corinthians 11:30, pro me autem nihil gloriabor nisi in infirmitatibus meis. If I must needs glory, I will glory of the things which concern mine infirmities. Magnificently to proclaim the infinite wisdom of God in establishing on earth a long misunderstood and persecuted race, which could now at last serve man in his first great need beyond earth. But it was neither the scientific demonstration that one need not disbelieve, nor the religious exhortation that one need not hate and fear that converted the great masses of mankind. That conversion came when Streak, the canine king of the kinescope, the most beloved quadruped in the history of show business, announced that he had chosen an acting career as a wolf dog, only because the competition was less intense than among human video actors. And besides, he is rumored to have added privately, "You meet fewer bitches, and their sons." The documentary that Streak commissioned for his special use, A Day in the Life of the Average Werewolf, removed the last traces of disbelief and fear, and finally brought forth the needed volunteers, no longer hesitant to declare themselves, lest they be shot down with silver bullets, or even forced to submit to psychoanalysis. As a matter of fact, this new possibility of public frankness cured immediately many of the analyst's most stubborn cases, hitherto driven to complex escapes by the necessity of either frustrating their very nature by never changing or practicing metamorphosis as a solitary vice. The problem now became one, not of finding volunteers, but of winnowing them. Fortunately, a retired agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, whose exploits as a werewolf of goodwill have been recounted elsewhere, undertook the task of cleaning out the criminal element, which statistical psychology has since established as running no higher, allowing for the inevitable historical effects of repression and discrimination than in other groups. Professor Guru devised the requisite aptitude tests. One minor misfortune of the winnowing process may be mentioned. A beautiful Australian actress, whose clarity of diction, in either form, and linguistic talent strongly recommended her, proved to metamorphose not into the European wolf, Canis lupus, but into the Tasmanian Thylacinus cynocephalus. And Professor Guru, no doubt rightly, questioned the effect upon the Martians of her marsupial pouch, highly esteemed though it was by connoisseurs of such matters. The rest is history. There is no need to detail here the communicative triumphs of that embassy and its successors. The very age of interplanetary amity in which we live is their monument. Nor should we neglect to pay tribute to the brilliant and charming were-apes, who so ably represent their mother planet in the Martian embassies here on Earth. For once, the Martians had recognized the perfection of the Hunyadi solution. Their folklorists realized that they too had long suffered a minority problem, whose existence the majority had never suspected. And Cardinal Mezzalupo's tribute to divine wisdom was echoed by the High Vrak himself, that monster of legend. The were-primate who took his rightful place among the valued citizens of Mars. It would be only fitting if this brief sketch could end with a touching picture of the contented old age of Professor Hunyadi, to whom two worlds owe so infinitely much. But that restless and unfulfilled genius has once more departed on an interplanetary expedition, trusting ever that the god of the Cardinal and the Vrak has somewhere designed a planet peopled by a bat-like race, Vampirus sapiens, to which he will be the ideal first ambassador. The Fun They Had, by Isaac Asimov. Margie even wrote about it that night in her diary. On the page headed May 17th, 2155, she wrote, "Today Tommy found a real book." It was a very old book. Margie's grandfather once said that when he was a little boy, his grandfather told him that there was a time when all stories were printed on paper. They turned the pages, which were yellow and crinkly, and it was awfully funny to read words that stood still instead of moving the way they were supposed to, on a screen, you know. And then, when they turned back to the page before, it had the same words on it that it had had when they read it the first time. "Gee," said Tommy, "what a waste. When you're through with the book, you just throw it away, I guess. Our television screen must have had 1,000,000 books on it, and it's good for plenty more. I wouldn't throw it away." "Same with mine," said Margie. She was 11 and hadn't seen as many telebooks as Tommy had. He was 13. She said, "Where did you find it?" "In my house." He pointed without looking because he was busy reading. "In the attic. What's it about?" "School." Margie was scornful. "School? What's there to write about school? I hate school." Margie always hated school, but now she hated it more than ever. The mechanical teacher had been giving her test after test in geography, and she had been doing worse and worse until her mother had shaken her head sorrowfully and sent for the county inspector. He was a round little man with a red face and a whole box of tools with dials and wires. He smiled at her and gave her an apple, then took the teacher apart. Margie had hoped he wouldn't know how to put it together again, but he knew how all right, and after an hour or so, there it was again, large and black and ugly, with a big screen on which all the lessons were shown and the questions were asked. That wasn't so bad. The part she hated most was the slot where she had to put homework and test papers. She always had to write them out in a punch code they made her learn when she was 6 years old, and the mechanical teacher calculated the mark in no time. The inspector had smiled after he was finished and patted her head. He said to her mother, "It's not the little girl's fault, Mrs. Jones. I think the geography sector was geared a little too quick. Those things happen sometimes. I've slowed it up to an average 10-year level. Actually, the overall pattern of her progress is quite satisfactory." And he patted Margie's head again. Margie was disappointed. She had been hoping they would take the teacher away altogether. They had once taken Tommy's teacher away for nearly a month because the history sector had blanked out completely. So she said to Tommy, "Why would anyone write about school?" Tommy looked at her with very superior eyes. "Because it's not our kind of school. Stupid. This is the old kind of school that they had hundreds and hundreds of years ago." He added loftily, pronouncing the word carefully, "Centuries ago." Margie was hurt. "Well, I don't know what kind of school they had all that time ago." She read the book over his shoulder for a while, then said, "Anyway, they had a teacher." "Sure, they had a teacher, but it wasn't a regular teacher. It was a man." "A man? How could a man be a teacher?" "Well, he just told the boys and girls things and gave them homework and asked them questions." "A man isn't smart enough." "Sure he is. My father knows as much as my teacher." "He can't. A man can't know as much as a teacher. He knows almost as much, I betcha." Margie wasn't prepared to dispute that. She said, "I wouldn't want a strange man in my house to teach me." Tommy screamed with laughter. "You don't know much, Margie. The teachers didn't live in the house. They had a special building and all the kids went there. And all the kids learned the same thing? Sure, if they were the same age. But my mother says a teacher has to be adjusted to fit the mind of each boy and girl it teaches, and that each kid has to be taught differently. Just the same. They didn't do it that way then. If you don't like it, you don't have to read the book." "I didn't say I didn't like it," Margie said quickly. She wanted to read about those funny schools. They weren't even half finished when Margie's mother called, "Margie, school!" Margie looked up. "Not yet, Mama." "Now," said Mrs. Jones. "And it's probably time for Tommy too." Margie said to Tommy, "Can I read the book some more with you after school?" "Maybe," he said nonchalantly. He walked away whistling, the dusty old book tucked beneath his arm. Margie went into the schoolroom. It was right next to her bedroom, and the mechanical teacher was on and waiting for her. It was always on at the same time every day, except Saturday and Sunday, because her mother said little girls learned better if they learned at regular hours. The screen was lit up and it said, "Today's arithmetic lesson is on the addition of proper fractions. Please insert yesterday's homework in the proper slot." Margie did so with a sigh. She was thinking about the old schools they had when her grandfather's grandfather was a little boy. All the kids from the whole neighborhood came, laughing and shouting in the schoolyard, sitting together in the schoolroom, going home together at the end of the day. They learned the same things so they could help one another on the homework and talk about it. And the teachers were people. The mechanical teacher was flashing on the screen. When we add the fractions 1/2 and 1/4, Margie was thinking about how the kids must have loved it in the old days. She was thinking about the fun they had. Men Are Different, written by Alan Block. I'm an archaeologist and men are my business. Just the same, I wonder if we'll ever find out about men. I mean, really find out what made men different from us robots by digging around on the dead planets. You see, I lived with a man once, and I know it isn't as simple as they told us back in school. We have a few records, of course, and robots like me are filling in some of the gaps, but I think now that we aren't really getting anywhere. We know, or at least the historians say we know, that men came from a planet called Earth. We know, too, that they rode out bravely from star to star, and wherever they stopped, they left colonies, men, robots, and sometimes both, against their return. But they never came back. Those were the shining days of the world. But are we so old now? Men had a bright flame, the old word is divine, I think, that flung them far across the night skies, and we have lost the strands of the web they wove. Our scientists tell us that men were very much like us, and the skeleton of a man is, to be sure, almost the same as the skeleton of a robot, except that it's made of some calcium compound instead of titanium. Just the same, there are other differences. It was on my last field trip to one of the inner planets that I met the man. He must have been the last man in this system, and he'd forgotten how to talk. He'd been alone so long. Once he learned our language, we got along fine together, and I planned to bring him back with me. Something happened to him, though. One day, for no reason at all, he complained of the heat. I checked his temperature and decided that his thermostat circuits were shot. I had a kit of field spares with me, and he was obviously out of order, so I went to work. I turned him off without any trouble. I pushed the needle into his neck to operate the cutoff switch, and he stopped moving, just like a robot. But when I opened him up, he wasn't the same inside. And when I put him back together, I couldn't get him running again. Then he sort of weathered away. And by the time I was ready to come home, about a year later, there was nothing left of him but bones. Yes, men are indeed different. Oscar. Written by Cleve Cartmill. Paul Rocky parked his roadster in front of the beer joint. "She lives in that corner apartment house," he said. "We'll meet here after." "I'd like to raise an objection," Michael Corbin said. Terrence Finnegan and Paul Rocky regarded Corbin with patient annoyance. Corbin's lean face flushed. "My objection is valid," he protested. "Suppose this girl goes nuts. We'd be in a hell of a jam." Terrence Finnegan laid a large, fatherly hand on Corbin's shoulder. "Mike, my son, we rehearsed for 2 hours with Elsie. Did she turn a hair? No, nor will this friend of Paul's. Elsie is a tailor's dummy. Aren't all women? Don't be so glib, Terry. I contend it's dangerous. According to Paul, this girl has occult leanings. She wants to believe in such phenomena as our imaginary Oscar. If we play our parts well enough, I tell you we're running a risk." "I'm not as concerned for Linda's sanity," Paul Rocky interposed, "as I am about your acting." "Okay, let's go." In the third-floor corridor of the apartment building, Paul Rocky rapped on a door. It was presently opened by a pretty brunette in blue slacks. "Oh, good," she said. "Company." The 3 young men trooped inside. Paul Rocky made a vague motion toward his companions. "Linda, may I present Terry Finnegan and—" He broke off. Michael Corbin was following an unseen something around the walls with cold blue eyes. Rocky cleared his throat. Mike." Corbin started. "Sorry," he murmured to the girl. "How do you do?" "And Michael Corbin, Linda Houseman." Finnegan closed the door. He and Rocky exchanged a significant glance, turned compassionate eyes on Corbin, shook their heads in brief pity. Linda, observing the byplay, frowned fleetingly and motioned them to chairs. "Would you like a whiskey and soda?" 3 contented sighs were born. As ice tinkled in the kitchen, Corbin asked a question with his eyebrows. 2 nods of affirmation answered him. Linda brought a tray of drinks, tucked a leg under her on a divan, and raised her glass. "Do we drink to something, or do we just drink?" "To our beautiful barmaid," Corbin responded. "My father told me only last week." "Last night you said he was killed in the big wind of 1906, Rocky interrupted. "That wasn't the blow that killed father. He told me only last week that brunettes, as compared to blondes..." He halted. Again his eyes followed an unseen something across the walls. Rocky and Finnegan dropped embarrassed glances to their drinks. Rocky made a hollow effort to break the tension. "What have you been doing lately, Linda?" She, intent upon Corbin, did not heed the question. Finnegan nodded at Rocky. "He's got it again," Rocky said in disgust. "Mike!" Finnegan snapped. Corbin jumped. Like a man awakening from heavy sleep, he blinked and gradually oriented himself. "As I was saying," he mumbled, "where was I?" "I think we'd better explain," Rocky said to the wide-eyed Linda. "Mike thinks he's a psychic phenomenon. He has a familiar spirit who, in a spirit of familiarity, he calls Oscar." "Nuts," Finnegan snorted. "There's nothing the matter with him, except he's crazy." "He sees a thing," Rocky continued smoothly. "It follows him. He can't or won't describe it. It is not always visible. He sees it, or claims he does, only on some nights in an enclosure, a room, auditorium, or a similar place. It never manifests itself in daylight. Don't feel ill at ease. It never bothers anybody. Terry and I don't pay attention to it anymore. All we can do," Finnegan added, "is apologize for him. Of course, this peculiarity of his distracts attention from some of his more obvious defects, and people get the impression that he's a pretty nice guy, except for his fixation." Michael Corbin watched Linda narrowly during the conversation. When she looked at him, he spoke confidentially. "I feel that we are kindred spirits, Miss Houseman. We know that forces, beings, exist that cannot be explained in terms familiar to such clods as my friends. But you and I, and others like us, we know." Linda's lips were parted, her forgotten drink clutched in both hands. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes." "Don't let him sell you on it, Miss Houseman," Finnegan said, "and drink your drink before it gets warm." "Let's talk of something else," Rocky proposed. "If Mike gets started, he'll talk all night on other plane beings. I remember one drunk and stormy night." His voice died. His jaw dropped. His eyes, as Corbin's had, followed an unseen something along the base of a wall. He became rigid. "What is this, a gag?" Finnegan snarled. Corbin flung him a smug and sardonic look. Linda's wide, dark eyes moved slowly from one to the other. With a slight shudder, she set aside her drink. Rocky, in the manner of a sleepwalker, set down his drink and walked stiffly from the apartment, without a glance at Linda or a word of farewell. "What the hell's the matter with you?" Finnegan snapped. "Where are you going?" After the door had closed behind Rocky, the three sat quietly. Corbin's lips formed a faint smile. Finnegan gulped the last of his drink and set the glass on the floor. Linda's glance moved fearfully about the room, questing, searching each corner. "This is a lot of nonsense," Finnegan growled. "Be a good boy, Oscar." Corbin tossed over his shoulder at an empty corner. "It's gone far enough," Finnegan continued. "I never told you before, Mike, but I think this is just a pose on your part to get attention you wouldn't receive otherwise, because of a colorless and stupid nature. I'll grant that the accumulated effect of these painful incidents might persuade a weak-minded visionary like Paul that he saw something for a moment. Your low cunning broke through for an instant. Well, I resent this pose of yours, and you either drop it or I don't want your friendship." He paused. "May I have another drink, Miss Houseman?" Linda took his glass solemnly and went into the kitchen. Corbin and Finnegan grinned at each other. When Linda came into the room again, Finnegan smiled his thanks for the fresh drink and continued, directing his remarks at the girl. "Hope you'll excuse my vehemence, but I'm fed up with this gag. I don't like to be made feel a fool. And when Paul walked out of here like a corpse, it was embarrassing. If he had brains enough to come in out of an air raid, he'd have known he didn't see anything. He only thought he did. Mike doesn't see anything either. Finnegan gasped. His eyes froze on something in the kitchen doorway. Corbin turned lazily, looked toward the kitchen, and shrugged. Linda put a taut hand to her throat. Finnegan got stiffly to his feet. With the glass still in his hand, he backed to the door. He reached behind him, opened it, and backed into the hallway, his eyes still riveted on the kitchen entrance. When the door closed and the sound of footsteps receded, Corbin looked at his watch. "Now, we are alone with it," he said in sepulchral tones. "In 5 minutes it will be midnight, the end of an old day. This is the first time anyone else has ever seen Oscar. Perhaps that is an omen." He mused silently for a second. "Perhaps this time it won't follow me out." "No, no," Linda whimpered as he rose. A strangling scream gurgled in her throat as she fastened her eyes on the kitchen doorway. Corbin followed her glance. The short hairs on his neck stiffened, and a chill fluttered down his spine. In the kitchen doorway squatted a dark thing. It had 2 living snakes for arms and a large green eye.
"Well," it snarled with a hoarse voice. "Well."
Random sample. Written by T.P. Caravan. If you don't give me another piece of candy, I'll cry. You'd be surprised how loud I can cry. Mother wouldn't like that. Thank you. I just love candy. I'm very polite for my age. Everybody says so. I can get more candy that way. Old ladies are best. I'm also a very intelligent little girl. But I suppose you found that out from your tests. They gave me the same kind of tests, but they didn't give me any candy, so I was bad and didn't answer anything right. Thank you. I'll take 2 this time. Do you have any hard candies? The heat's melted these chocolates a little. My father says to get all I can out of you, because all you Viennese head thumpers are quacks. He says you cost an awful lot of money. He says only an old fraud would have a beard like a billy goat. He says, are you getting angry? All right then, if you give me just 1 more piece of candy, I'll tell you all about it. Merci, that's French, you know. My brother Johnny and I were out in the backyard, stomping ants when the spaceship came down. It's fun sometimes to watch ants. They run around so hopefully going about their business, carrying little bits of twigs and things in their mouths. And they don't even seem to know you're there until your foot just about touches them. Then they run away, waving their feelers before they squish. But the big red ants are the really good ones. You can jump right spang on them, and they don't even seem to notice it. I guess they sink into the ground a little ways, because if you pound one between 2 rocks, he squishes without any trouble. They taste funny. Once Johnny saw a red one fighting a black one, and they kept on fighting until he burned them both up with his magnifying glass. Will you buy me a magnifying glass if I tell you about it? I'd just love to have a magnifying glass. I bet the ant thinks the sun is spread out over the whole sky. I bet he thinks the whole world is burning up. I bet it hurts. I bet I could burn up more ants than Johnny can, even though I'm a whole year younger. He's 10. Please, can I have a magnifying glass? Please. Please, can I? Can I? I'll cry. When can I have it? Thank you. It was his birthday, so I let him take the ones near the anthill. I'm really very generous at times. You let them get almost down the hole before you jump on them. That's the most fun. I was watching one I'd pulled the legs off, waiting to see if the others would eat it, when Johnny yelled for me to come quick, and I went running over. He showed me one ant carrying another on its back, trying to get it down into the ant hill before we squished it. We were just about to stomp on its little head when we heard the noise in the sky. It was the kind of squeaky sound I make when I pull my fingernail along the blackboard in school and make old Miss Cooper get the shivers. I hate Miss Cooper. She doesn't give me any candy. Thank you. And I never answer any questions for her. We looked up and saw the rocket ship coming down for a landing in the woods. It didn't look like a ship to me, but that's what Johnny says it was. It looked like a big washing machine to me. Father says it was a hallucination. I like big words, but he didn't even see it, so how could he know? Sometimes I hate Father. Are you writing that down? Was that the right thing to say? Can I have some more candy? Thank you. This is very good, even if it is melted. I should think you could afford to have your office air conditioned. Then the candy wouldn't melt at all. If you were smart, you'd think of these things. What happened? I've told it over and over, but nobody believes me. Isn't that sad? I don't think I'll tell anybody else about it. The whole box? For me? Thank you, I just love chocolates. Your beard isn't really much like a billy goat's. We saw it come down in the woods, and we ran over to the place. Nobody else was there. The grass and underbrush was burning a little, but they were putting it out. And when they saw us, they stopped still and made little noises to each other. I held up my hand and I said, "I'm queen here. You must all bow down." And Johnny held up his hand and said, "I'm king." He never thinks of anything for himself. I hate them. They didn't bow down to me. One of them picked up a squirrel that had been burned a little when they landed, and he was petting it and putting something on the burned place, and he didn't pay any attention to me. I hated him most of all, so I went over and kicked him. He was smaller than Johnny, so Johnny kicked him too. I kicked him first, though, and he was just my size. What did they look like? They didn't look like little old billy goats. They took us inside their spaceship, and they started to give us some tests, like the one you gave me. They were very simple tests, but I didn't like them, so I got them all wrong. Johnny got them all wrong too because I told him. I'd scratch his eyes out if he didn't. I remember some of them. They drew little triangles with boxes on 2 of the sides, and then they gave me the pen and waited to see what I'd do. I fooled them. I took the pen and threw ink all over them. It wasn't a pen exactly, but it was like one. Then they held up 1 little block, then 2, then 3, then 4. They did this a few times, and then they held up 1 block, then 2. Then they waited for me to pick up 3. I picked up all the blocks and hit them over the head with them. I had a lot of fun. I was very bad. They got Johnny off in a corner, and before you could say, "Boo," he was telling them about all the people he'd killed in the war. He wasn't really in the war, of course, but he likes to pretend he was. He likes television best when they kill lots of people. I don't think they really knew what he was talking about, but they looked as if they did. He's a very good actor. I suppose they thought we were grown-ups. They were pretty much the same size we are. Anyway, they paid a lot of attention to him, so I went over and punched him a couple of times. I'm afraid we broke up the insides of their spaceship a little. They looked pretty mad. I guess they were disgusted with Johnny. A lot of people are. I always try to make a good impression on strangers, even when they don't give me any candy. So I took some of them outside and showed them how to stomp ants. It was very funny. One of them got sick. Johnny and I were still jumping up and down, stomping ants, when they took off. I hated them. They were nasty. They didn't bow down to me. That's all. Nothing else happened. Father says not to take up too much of your expensive old time. He says no honest man could afford a penthouse for his office. You have a very nice view, don't you? You can see all over the city from here. Isn't it hot? I wish I had a refrigerator to keep my candy in. Look there. Look at the fires springing up across the river. Aren't they pretty? Look. Oh, look. And some on this side. take me away from here. It's too hot. Look at the sun. Look at it. It's spreading out over the whole sky. It's burning up the city. Billy Goat, help me. Save me. I'm sorry. I am so sorry that I was bad. Teething Ring. Written by James Causey. Half an hour before, while she had been engrossed in the current soap opera and Harry Jr. was screaming in his crib, Melinda would naturally have slammed the front door in the little man's face. However, when the bell rang, she was wearing her new Chinese red housecoat, had just lustered her nails to a blinding scarlet, and Harry Jr. was sleeping like an angel. Yawning, Melinda answered the door, and the little man said, beaming, "Excellent day. I have gewgaws for information." Melinda did not quite recoil. He was perhaps 5 feet tall, with a gleaming, hairless scalp and a young old face. He wore a plain gray tunic, and a peddler's tray hung from his thin shoulders. "Don't want any," Melinda stated flatly. "Please." He had great, beseeching amber eyes. "They all say that. I haven't much time. I must be back at the university by noon." "You working your way through college?" He brightened. "Yes, I suppose you could call it that. Alien anthropology major." Melinda softened. The initiations those frats pulled nowadays, shaving the poor guy's head, eating goldfish, it was criminal. "Well?" she asked grudgingly. "What's in the tray?" "Flangers," said the little man eagerly. "Oscilloscopes, portable force field generators, a neural distorter." Melinda's face was blank. The little man frowned. "You use them, of course? This is a Class I free culture?" Melinda essayed a weak shrug, and the little man sighed with relief. His eyes fled past her to the blank screen of the TV set. "Ah, a monitor." He smiled. "For a moment I was afraid." "May I come in?" Melinda shrugged and opened the door. This might be interesting, like a vacuum cleaner salesman who had cleaned her drapes last week for free, and Kitty Kyle Battle's life wouldn't be on for almost an hour. "My name is Porteous," said the little man with an eager smile. "I'm doing a thematic on Class 4 cultures." He whipped out a stylus, began jotting down notes. The TV set fascinated him. "It's turned off right now," Melinda said. Porteous's eyes widened impossibly. "You mean," he whispered in horror, "that you're exercising Class Fee privileges? This is terribly confusing. I get doors slammed in my face when Class 4s are supposed to have a splendid gregarian quotient. You do have atomic power, don't you?" "Oh, sure," said Melinda uncomfortably. This wasn't going to be much fun. "Space travel?" The little face was intent, sharp. "Well," Melinda yawned, looking at the blank screen. "They've got Space Patrol, Space Cadet, Tales of Tomorrow." "Excellent. Rocket ships or force fields?" Melinda blinked. "Does your husband own one?" Melinda shook her blonde head helplessly. "What are your economic circumstances?" Melinda took a deep, rasping breath, said, "Listen, mister, is this a demonstration or a quiz program?" "Oh, my excuse. Demonstration, certainly. You will not mind the questions." "Questions?" There was an ominous glint in Melinda's blue eyes. "Your delightful primitive customs, art forms, personal habits." "Look," Melinda said, crimsoning. "This is a respectable neighborhood, and I'm not answering any Kinsey report, understand?" The little man nodded, scribbling. "Personal habits are taboo? I so regret. The demonstration." He waved grandly at the tray. Anti-grav sandals, a portable solar converter, apologizing for this miserable selection. "But on Capella, they told me..." He followed Melinda's entranced gaze, selected a tiny green vial. "This is merely a regenerative solution. You appear to have no cuts or bruises." "Oh," said Melinda nastily. "Cures warts, cancer, Grows hair, I suppose. Porteous brightened. Of course. I see you can scan. Amazing. He scribbled further with his stylus, glanced up, blinked at the obvious scorn on Melinda's face. Here, try it. You try it. Now watch him squirm. Porteous hesitated. Would you like me to grow an extra finger, hair? Grow some hair. Melinda tried not to smile. The little man unstopped the vial, poured a shimmering green drop on his wrist, frowning. Must concentrate, he said. Thorium base. Suspended solution. Really jolts the endocrines. Complete control. See? Melinda's jaw dropped. She stared at the tiny tuft of hair, which had sprouted on that bare wrist. She was thinking abruptly, unhappily, about that chignon she had bought yesterday. They had let her buy that for $8 when with this stuff she could have a natural one. How much? She inquired cautiously. A half hour of your time only, said Porteous. Melinda grasped the vial firmly, settled down on the sofa with one leg tucked carefully under her. Okay, shoot, but nothing personal. Porteous was delighted. He asked a multitude of questions, most of them pointless, some naive, and Melinda dug into her infinitesimal fund of knowledge and gave. The little man scribbled furiously, clucking like a gravid hen. You mean, he asked in amazement, that you live in these primitive huts of your own volition? It's a GI housing project, Melinda said, ashamed. Astonishing. He wrote, Feudal anachronisms and atomic power, side by side. Class wars periodically rough it in back-to-nature movements. Harry Jr. chose that moment to begin screaming for his lunch. Porteous sat, trembling. Is that a security alarm? My son, said Melinda despondently, and she went into the nursery. Porteous followed and watched the ululating child with some trepidation. Newborn? 18 months, said Melinda stiffly, changing diapers. He's cutting teeth. Porteous shuddered. What a pity. Obviously atavistic. Wouldn't the creche accept him? You shouldn't have to keep him here. I keep after Harry to get a maid, but he says we can't afford one. Manifestly insecure, muttered the little man, studying Harry Jr. Definite paranoid tendencies. He was 2 weeks premature, volunteered Melinda. He's real sensitive. I know just the thing, Porteous said happily. Here. He dipped into the glittering litter on the tray and handed Harry Jr. a translucent prism. A neural distorter. We use it to train regressives on Rigel 2. It might be of assistance. Melinda eyed the thing doubtfully. Harry Jr. was peering into the shifting crystal depths with a somewhat strained expression. Speeds up the neural flow, explained the little man proudly. Helps tap the unused 80%. The pre-symptomatic memory is unaffected because of automatic cerebral lapse in case of overload. I'm afraid it won't do much more than cube his present IQ, and an intelligent idiot is still an idiot. But... how dare you? Melinda's eyes flashed. My son is not an idiot. You get out of here this minute and take your... things with you. As she reached for the prism, Harry Jr. squalled. Melinda relented. Here, she said angrily, fumbling with her purse. How much are they? Medium of exchange? Porteous rubbed his bald skull. Oh, I really shouldn't, but it'll make such a wonderful addendum to the chapter on malignant primitives. What is your smallest denomination? Is $1 okay? Melinda was hopeful. Porteous was pleased with the picture of George Washington. He turned the bill over and over in his fingers, at last bowed low and formally, apologized for any taboo violations, and left via the front door. Crazy fraternities, muttered Melinda, turning on the TV set. Kitty Kyle was dull that morning. At length Melinda used some of the liquid in the green vial on her eyelashes, was quite pleased at the results, and hid the rest in the medicine cabinet. Harry Jr. was a model of docility the rest of that day, while Melinda watched TV and munched chocolates, did and redid her hair. Harry Jr. played quietly with the crystal prism. Toward late afternoon, he crawled over to the bookcase, wrestled down the encyclopedia and pawed through it, gurgling with delight. He definitely, Melinda decided, would make a fine lawyer someday, not a useless putterer like Big Harry, who worked all hours overtime in that damned lab. She scowled as Harry Jr., bored with the encyclopedia, began reaching for one of Big Harry's tomes on nuclear physics. One putterer in the family was enough. But when she tried to take the book away from him, Harry Jr. howled so violently that she let well enough alone. At 6:30, Big Harry called from the lab, with the usual despondent message that he would not be home for supper. Melinda said a few resigned things about cheerless dinners eaten alone, hinted darkly what lonesome wives sometimes did for company, and Harry said he was very sorry, but this might be it, and Melinda hung up on him in a temper. Precisely 15 minutes later, the doorbell rang. Melinda opened the front door and gaped. This little man could have been Porteus's double, except for the black metallic tunic, the glacial gray eyes. Mrs. Melinda Adams? Even the voice was frigid. Yes. Why? Major Nord, Galactic Security. The little man bowed. You were visited early this morning by one Porteus. He spoke the name with a certain disgust. He left a neural distorter here, correct? Melinda's nod was tremulous. Major Nord came quietly into the living room, shut the door behind him. My apologies, madam, for the intrusion. Porteus mistook your world for a Class 4 culture instead of a Class 7. Here. He handed her the crumpled dollar bill. You may check the serial number, the distorter, please. Melinda shrunk limply onto the sofa. I don't understand, she said painfully. Was he a thief? He was careless about his spatial coordinates. Major Nord's teeth showed in the faintest of smiles. He has been corrected. Where is it? Now look, said Melinda with some asperity. That thing's kept Harry Jr. quiet all day. I bought it in good faith, and it's not my fault, say. Have you got a warrant? Madam, said the Major with dignity. I dislike violating local taboos, but must I explain the impact of a neural distorter on a backwater culture? What if your Neanderthal had been given atomic blasters? Where would you have been today? Swinging through trees, no doubt. What if your Hitler had force fields? He exhaled. Where is your son? In the nursery, Harry Jr. was contentedly playing with his blocks. The prism lay glinting in the corner. Major Nord picked it up carefully, scrutinized Harry Jr. His voice was very soft. You said he was playing with it? Some vestigial maternal instinct prompted Melinda to shake her head vigorously. The little man stared hard at Harry Jr., who began whimpering. Trembling, Melinda scooped up Harry Jr. Is that all you have to do? Run around frightening women and children? Take your old distorter and get out. Leave decent people alone. Major Nord frowned, if only he could be sure. He peered stonily at Harry Jr., murmured, Definite egomania. It doesn't seem to have affected him. Strange. Do you want me to scream? Melinda demanded. Major Nord sighed. He bowed to Melinda, went out, closed the door, touched a tiny stud on his tunic, and vanished. The manners of some people, Melinda said to Harry Jr. She was relieved that the Major had not asked for the green vial. Harry Jr. also looked relieved, although for quite a different reason. Big Harry arrived home a little after 11. There were small worry creases about his mouth and forehead, and the leaden cast of defeat in his eyes. He went into the bedroom, and Melinda sleepily told him about the little man working his way through college by peddling silly goods, and about that rude cop named Nord. Harry said that was simply astonishing, and Melinda said, "Harry, you had a drink." "I had 2 drinks," Harry told her owlishly. "You married a failure, dear. Part of the experimental model, vaporized, whoosh, just like that. On paper, it looked so good." Melinda had heard it all before. She asked him to see if Harry Jr. was covered, and Big Harry went unsteadily into the nursery, sat down by his son's crib. "Poor little guy," he mused. "Your old man's a bum, a useless tinker. He thought he could send man to the stars on a string of helium nuclei. Oh, he was smart. Thought of everything. Auxiliary jets to kick off the negative charge. Bigger mercury vapor banks. A fine straight thrust of positive alpha particles." He hiccuped, put his face in his hands. "Didn't you ever stop to think that a few air molecules could defocus the stream? Try a vacuum, stupid." Big Harry stood up. "Did you say something, son?" "Gerfel," said Harry Jr. Big Harry reeled into the living room like a somnambulist. He got pencil and paper, began jotting frantic formula. Presently he called a cab and raced back to the laboratory. Melinda was dreaming about little bald men with diamond-studded trays. They were chasing her. They kept pelting her with rubies and emeralds. All they wanted was to ask questions, but she kept running. Harry Jr. clasped tightly in her arms. Now they were ringing alarm bells. The bells kept ringing and she groaned, sat up in bed and seized the telephone. "Darling." Big Harry's voice shook. "I've got it. More auxiliary shielding plus a vacuum. We'll be rich." "That's just fine," said Melinda crossly. "You woke the baby." Harry Jr. was sobbing bitterly into his pillow. He was sick with disappointment. Even the most favorable extrapolation showed it would take him 19 years to become master of the world. An eternity. The Weapon, written by Frederick Brown. The room was quiet in the dimness of early evening. Dr. James Graham, key scientist of a very important project, sat in his favorite chair, thinking. It was so still that he could hear the turning of pages in the next room as his son leafed through a picture book. Often Graham did his best work, his most creative thinking, under these circumstances, sitting alone in an unlighted room in his own apartment after the day's regular work. But tonight his mind would not work constructively. Mostly he thought about his mentally arrested son, his only son in the next room. The thoughts were loving thoughts, not the bitter anguish he had felt years ago when he had first learned of the boy's condition. The boy was happy. Wasn't that the main thing? And to how many men is given a child who will always be a child, who will not grow up to leave him? Certainly that was rationalization, but what is wrong with rationalization when... The doorbell rang. Graham rose and turned on lights in the almost dark room before he went through the hallway to the door. He was not annoyed. Tonight, at this moment, almost any interruption to his thoughts was welcome. He opened the door. A stranger stood there. He said, "Dr. Graham, my name is Niemand. I'd like to talk to you. May I come in a moment?" Graham looked at him. He was a small man, nondescript, obviously harmless, possibly a reporter or an insurance agent. But it didn't matter what he was. Graham found himself saying, "Of course! Come in, Mr. Niemand." A few minutes of conversation, he justified himself by thinking, might divert his thoughts and clear his mind. "Sit down," he said in the living room. "Care for a drink?" Niemand said, "No, thank you." He sat in the chair. Graham sat on the sofa. The small man interlocked his fingers. He leaned forward. He said, "Dr. Graham, you are the man whose scientific work is more likely than that of any other man to end the human race's chance for survival." A crackpot, Graham thought. Too late now, he realized that he should have asked the man's business before admitting him. It would be an embarrassing interview. He disliked being rude, yet only rudeness was effective. Dr. Graham, the weapon on which you are working." The visitor stopped and turned his head as the door that led to a bedroom opened and a boy of 15 came in. The boy didn't notice Niemand. He ran to Graham. "Daddy, will you read to me now?" The boy of 15 laughed the sweet laughter of a child of 4. Graham put an arm around the boy. He looked at his visitor, wondering whether he had known about the boy. From the lack of surprise on Niemand's face, Graham felt sure he had known. "Harry," Graham's voice was warm with affection, "Daddy's busy. Just for a little while. Go back to your room. I'll come and read to you soon." "Chicken Little? You'll read me, Chicken Little?" "If you wish. Now run along. Wait. Harry, this is Mr. Niemand." The boy smiled bashfully at the visitor. Niemand said, "Hi, Harry," and smiled back at him, holding out his hand. Graham, watching, was sure now that Niemand had known. The smile and the gesture were for the boy's mental age, not his physical one. The boy took Niemand's hand. For a moment it seemed that he was going to climb into Niemand's lap, and Graham pulled him back gently. He said, "Go to your room now, Harry." The boy skipped back into his bedroom, not closing the door. Niemand's eyes met Graham's, and he said, "I like him," with obvious sincerity. He added, "I hope that what you're going to read to him will always be true." Graham didn't understand. Niemand said, "Chicken Little, I mean. It's a fine story, but may Chicken Little always be wrong about the sky falling down." Graham suddenly had liked Niemand when Niemand had shown liking for the boy. Now he remembered that he must close the interview quickly. He rose in dismissal. He said, "I fear you're wasting your time and mine, Mr. Niemand. I know all the arguments. Everything you can say I've heard 1,000 times. Possibly there is truth in what you believe, but it does not concern me. I'm a scientist, and only a scientist. Yes, it is public knowledge that I'm working on a weapon, a rather ultimate one. But for me personally, that is only a byproduct of the fact that I am advancing science. I have thought it through, and I have found that that is my only concern. But, Dr. Graham, is humanity ready for an ultimate weapon?" Graham frowned. "I have told you my point of view, Mr. Niemand." Niemand rose slowly from the chair. He said, "Very well. If you do not choose to discuss it, I'll say no more." He passed a hand across his forehead. "I'll leave, Dr. Graham. I wonder, though, may I change my mind about the drink you offered me?" Graham's irritation faded. He said, "Certainly. Will whiskey and water do?" "Admirably." Graham excused himself and went into the kitchen. He got the decanter of whiskey, another of water, ice cubes, glasses. When he returned to the living room, Niemand was just leaving the boy's bedroom. He heard Niemand's, "Good night, Harry," and Harry's happy, "Night, Mr. Niemand." Graham made drinks. A little later, Niemand declined a second one and started to leave. Niemand said, "I took the liberty of bringing a small gift to your son, Doctor. I gave it to him while you were getting the drinks for us. I hope you'll forgive me." "Of course. Thank you. Good night." Graham closed the door. He walked through the living room into Harry's room. He said, "All right, Harry. Now I'll read to—" There was sudden sweat on his forehead, but he forced his face and his voice to be calm as he stepped to the side of the bed. "May I see that, Harry?" When he had it safely, his hands shook as he examined it. He thought, only a madman would give a loaded revolver to an idiot.